The check slid across the polished walnut table, its crisp edge catching the light from the chandelier above, and for a second I watched my father's reflection in the glossy surface before he even looked at me, before he even realized what I had just placed between his wine glass and the centerpiece arrangement he'd insisted cost more than my monthly rent, and he smiled that tight, practiced smile he always used when he was about to say something that sounded polite but wasn't, and then he said it loud enough for all 18 people at the table to hear. "Claire, sweetheart, you didn't need to bring anything. We know money's tight when you're doing what you do," and a few people chuckled softly, the kind of laughter that pretends to be harmless but lands exactly where it's meant to, and I felt my fingers tighten just slightly around the edge of my napkin as I looked down at the black leather bill holder I had set in front of him, the one with the embossed logo he hadn't noticed yet, the one detail that didn't belong in his version of this night, because in his version, this dinner was about celebrating 35 years of marriage, about Madison's promotion, about everything our family liked to display as proof that we were exactly who we claimed to be, and in his version, I was just the afterthought at the end of the table, the daughter who showed up late, who worked nights, who smelled faintly of cleaning solution no matter how many times I washed my hands before coming here. But what he didn't know was that I had chosen this table, this restaurant, this exact moment for a reason, and as my mother leaned forward, placing her hand lightly on his arm like she always did when she wanted to soften his words without actually disagreeing, she added, "Your father just means you don't have to worry about contributing tonight, honey. We've got it covered." And across from me, Madison lifted her glass, her perfectly manicured nails catching the same light as the chandelier, and said, "Honestly, Claire, you should just enjoy the free meal. You've earned a break from scrubbing floors." And this time the laughter was louder, more comfortable, like everyone had been waiting for permission to join in, and I nodded once slowly as if I agreed, as if this was exactly who I was and exactly where I belonged, and I could feel the weight of my phone in my purse, the screen still open to the account I had checked twice in the parking lot before walking in, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remind myself that numbers don't lie the way people do, and I let the moment stretch just long enough for the laughter to fade into that awkward quiet that always follows something that went a little too far, and I reached forward, sliding the leather holder an inch closer to my father, watching as his eyes finally dropped to the logo stamped in gold, watching the slight crease form between his brows as something didn't quite line up with what he expected, and for the first time that night, he didn't have a comment ready, and I could feel every set of eyes at the table shifting, recalibrating, trying to understand why I wasn't shrinking the way I always did, why I wasn't smiling it off or changing the subject or quietly excusing myself like I had 100 times before. And I rested my hands flat on the table, steady, deliberate, as I met his gaze and said, "You're right. I didn't need to bring anything." And I let that sit there, unfinished, incomplete, because some things land harder when you don't rush them, and in that silence, in that small break in the script they'd all memorized about who I was supposed to be, I realized this was the last time I would ever let them tell that story for me, but what they didn't know was that the check wasn't the point and it never had been. My father turned the bill holder over once, then again, like the answer might be printed somewhere else if he looked hard enough, and I could see the exact moment his confidence slipped, just a fraction, just enough for my mother to notice because her hand tightened around her glass and she leaned in slightly, her voice softer now but sharper underneath. "Claire, what is this?" And I shrugged, not carelessly, but with the kind of calm that comes from knowing something no one else in the room does, and I said, "Just open it." And for a second no one moved, not Madison, not my uncle halfway through his second glass of wine, not even the server who had been hovering politely near the edge of the table, because the energy had shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, like the air right before a storm you cannot see yet, and my father finally slid his thumb under the flap and opened it, his eyes scanning the inside, expecting a receipt, a total, something ordinary, something that would fit neatly into the version of me he had already decided on years ago. And I watched as his expression stalled, as his mouth opened slightly and then closed again, and he looked back up at me, not with anger, not yet, but with confusion, like he was trying to figure out where the script had gone wrong, and Madison leaned forward, impatient, reaching across the table before he could say anything. "What is it, Dad?" she said, her tone light but edged with curiosity, and she pulled the holder closer to herself, glancing inside, and then I saw it happen again, that same flicker, that same hesitation, except this time it came with something else, something closer to disbelief, and she let out a short laugh that did not sound like laughter at all. "Okay, very funny, Claire," she said, pushing it back toward me as if it might burn her fingers if she held it too long. "Did you ask someone to do this for you?" And I tilted my head slightly, genuinely curious how far they would go to avoid what was right in front of them, and I said, "Do what?" And my father cleared his throat, straightening in his chair like he was reclaiming control of the room. "Enough," he said, his voice firmer now, more like the one he used when he wanted to shut something down before it got uncomfortable. "If this is some kind of joke, it is not appropriate." And I met his eyes, steady, unflinching, and for the first time that night I did not feel like I was sitting at the edge of the table. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and I said, "It is not a joke." And the silence that followed was heavier this time because now there was something in it that none of them could quite name, something that did not fit into the roles they had assigned me. And my mother set her glass down carefully like she was buying time and asked, "Then explain it." And I reached into my purse slowly, deliberately, pulling out my phone and placing it on the table next to the holder, the screen already awake, already waiting, and I turned it so they could see not all of it, not yet, just enough to show the top line, the balance, the numbers that did not match the story they had been telling about me for years. And I watched their faces change in real time, watched my father's jaw tighten, my mother's eyes narrow slightly as if she could focus hard enough to make it make sense, watched Madison lean in closer despite herself, like she could not stop looking even if she wanted to, and I did not say anything else because I knew words would only give them something to argue with, something to twist, and numbers did not do that. Numbers just sat there, undeniable, indifferent, and for a long second no one spoke, not even the relatives who had been so quick to laugh just moments before. And I realized then that this was not about the check or the bill or even the money, it was about the space between who they thought I was and who I had actually become, and that space was finally wide enough that they could not ignore it anymore, and I folded my hands calmly in front of me, letting the silence stretch, letting them sit in it, because for once I was not the one trying to fill it, and I did not rush to explain, I did not soften it for them because I had spent too many years doing exactly that, and I was done. But what I did not realize then was that this moment was only the beginning of something none of us were prepared for. Madison was the first one to break because she always was when something did not go her way, and she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms like she could physically push the moment away from her, and said, "There is no way this is real." But her voice did not have the same confidence it had 10 minutes ago. It was thinner now, stretched tight over something she could not control, and my father picked up my phone without asking, holding it closer to his face as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough, and I watched his eyes move across the screen, reading every digit, every decimal, every detail he used to believe I was incapable of understanding, and he said quietly, almost to himself, "This is a business account." And that was the first time anyone at that table said something true about me that night, and my mother's head snapped toward him. "What do you mean business account?" she asked, her voice sharper now because confusion was turning into something else, something closer to unease, and he handed the phone back to me, slower this time, more careful, like it suddenly mattered how he treated something that belonged to me, and he said, "Claire, where did this come from?" And I let out a small breath, not a sigh, not frustration, just the release of holding back for too long, and I said, "From work?" And Madison laughed again, but this time it came out forced, like she needed it to be true more than she believed it. "From what? Cleaning offices," she said, and I looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time I noticed how much of her confidence depended on me staying exactly where I had always been, and I said, "Yes, actually." And that made a few people shift in their seats because now the joke was not landing the way it was supposed to, and my uncle leaned in, curiosity replacing amusement. "You are saying you made that from cleaning?" he asked, and I nodded once. "From building a company that started with cleaning," I said, and I could see the words hitting them in pieces, not all at once because that would have been too easy, too clean, and my mother shook her head slowly, like she was trying to reset the conversation back to something she understood. "Claire, you have always had a job, that is not the same as running a company," she said, and I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable, and I said, "I know the difference." And I turned the phone slightly, scrolling just enough to show them transaction histories, deposits, contract payments, numbers tied to names they might actually recognize if they paid attention. And I watched their faces again, the way disbelief started giving way to calculation, to quiet reevaluation, and Madison leaned forward despite herself, her voice lower now. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, and that question hung in the air for a second, because it was not just about money anymore, it was about time, about everything they had missed, everything they had dismissed, and I answered simply, "Long enough." And my father exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his posture no longer as rigid as before, like something inside him had shifted whether he wanted it to or not, and he said, "Why did you not tell us?" And that was the question, the one that mattered more than all the others, and I held his gaze steady, calm, and I said, "Because every time I tried to tell you anything, you had already decided what it meant." And no one laughed this time, no one interrupted because they could hear it, not just the words but everything underneath them, every dinner, every comment, every small moment that had added up to this one. And I rested my hands back on the table, feeling the smooth wood under my palms, grounding myself in the present, because this was the moment I had imagined more times than I could count, and it was quieter than I expected, heavier, more real. And for the first time in my life, they were the ones trying to understand me instead of the other way around, but what I did not realize then was that understanding was not the same as accepting, and that was where things were about to get complicated. My mother was the first to recover because she always knew how to reshape a situation into something that made her comfortable again, and she straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her dress like she could smooth over what had just happened, and said, "Well, that is impressive, Claire." Her tone carefully measured, polite in a way that felt unfamiliar coming from her, and I could hear the shift in it immediately. The difference between dismissal and something closer to cautious interest, and Madison followed right behind her, leaning forward again but this time with a different kind of focus, her eyes flicking between me and my phone. "Wait, so you actually run this?" she asked, and there was something in her voice I had never heard directed at me before. Not respect exactly, but curiosity that bordered on it, and I nodded once, keeping my expression neutral, because I knew better than to mistake curiosity for understanding. And my father cleared his throat. Again, slower this time, like he was choosing his words more carefully than he had earlier. "You should have told us sooner," he said, and that sentence hung in the air longer than the others because it sounded like acknowledgement, but it carried something else underneath it, something that felt a lot like rewriting the past, like this moment could erase every other one that had come before it. And I looked at him, really looked at him, and I said, "I tried." And that was all I said, because anything more would have turned it into an argument, and I was not interested in arguing anymore. And for a second no one responded because there was nothing clean they could say back to that without admitting something they were not ready to admit, and my uncle shifted in his chair again, breaking the tension with a half smile. "So what exactly do you do?" he asked, and I could feel the room leaning in again, but differently now, not to laugh but to listen, and I answered simply, "We manage commercial cleaning contracts, mostly for medical offices, law firms, and a few restaurant groups." And I let the word group sit there because it mattered, and Madison blinked, processing it. "Restaurant groups," she repeated, glancing around the table as if trying to connect it to something familiar, and my father's eyes moved again, this time not to my phone but to the room itself, to the staff moving quietly in the background, to the details he had overlooked before, and I saw it click. Not fully, but enough, and he said more quietly now, "This place." And I did not interrupt him. I just watched as the realization started to take shape in his mind, and my mother followed his gaze, her expression tightening slightly as she took in the same details, the same logo, the same subtle differences that had been invisible to them before, and Madison let out a short breath. "No way," she said under her breath, and I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding myself again, because this was the part one had not been sure about, not the reveal itself but what came after, the moment when the truth stopped being abstract and started becoming real to them. And my father leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, controlled but no longer certain. "Claire, do you own part of this restaurant?" And I met his gaze without hesitation, without apology, and I said, "Yes." And that single word landed heavier than anything else I had said all night, because it was not just about money anymore, it was about position, about control, about the fact that the space they had chosen to celebrate themselves in was one I had a say in. And the table went completely still, no clinking glasses, no quiet conversations from nearby tables reaching us, just a silence that felt dense, almost physical, and I could see each of them recalculating in their own way. My mother with her careful composure, Madison with her restless disbelief, my father with that slow, deliberate way he processed anything that threatened his authority, and for the first time, I was not outside of that calculation, I was at the center of it, and I folded my hands together again, calm, steady, because I knew this moment would not last forever, that eventually they would find a way to fit this into their version of the world, but right now, right here, they did not have one, and I was not going to give it to them because this was not about making them comfortable, it was about finally being seen for what I was, not what they had decided I was years ago. and as I sat there watching them struggle to adjust, I realized something I had not expected, something that shifted the weight of the entire night, because for the first time I was not wondering if they would accept me, I was wondering if I even wanted them to, but what I did not realize then was that their next move would make that decision a lot clearer than I was ready for. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like everyone at the table was waiting to see who would move first, and of course it was my father, because it always was when control started slipping away from him, and he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together in a way that looked calm but felt calculated, and said, "Well, that explains a lot," as if he had known all along, as if this moment was just confirmation of something he had already suspected, and I almost smiled at that because it was exactly what I had expected, not surprise, not apology but adjustment, the quiet rewriting of the story so that he was never really wrong, and my mother nodded beside him, quick to align herself with whatever version made the most sense in that moment. "We always knew you were capable of more, Claire," she added, her tone warm now, almost proud, and that word hit me harder than anything else they had said that night, not because it sounded kind but because it was so clearly unearned, and Madison leaned forward again, her earlier disbelief now replaced with something sharper, something more strategic. "So what exactly is your role in all of this?" she asked, and I could hear it in her voice, the shift from mocking to measuring, like she was trying to figure out where I fit in a hierarchy she understood, and I answered simply, "I built it." And that seemed to land differently, because there was no way to soften that, no way to interpret it as luck or timing or someone else's effort, and my uncle let out a low whistle. "From cleaning offices to owning part of a restaurant," he said, shaking his head slightly. "That is quite the jump," and I nodded once because it was, but not in the way they were thinking, not in a single leap, but in hundreds of small, invisible steps no one had bothered to notice, and my father leaned forward again, his eyes sharper now, focused. "And this is stable?" he asked, and that question told me everything I needed to know about how he saw the world, not what I had done, but whether it could be trusted, whether it fit into his definition of success, and I met his gaze and said, "Yes," and I did not elaborate because I did not need to, and my mother smiled then a little too quickly. "Well, we are proud of you," she said, and there it was, the word again, offered like it could fix everything that had come before it, like it could fill in the years of silence, the dismissive comments, the quiet exclusions, and for a second, just a second, I felt the weight of that word the way I used to wait for it, hope for it, measure myself against it, but it did not land the same anymore, it did not carry the same meaning because it came too late and too easily, and Madison glanced at my phone again, her eyes lingering on the numbers before she looked back at me. "You could have told me," she said, softer now, almost like a complaint, and I tilted my head slightly, considering that, and I said, "Would it have changed anything?" And she did not answer, because we both knew it would not have, not then. Not when I was still the version of me they had already decided on, and my father cleared his throat again, shifting the focus back to something he could manage. "So what are your plans moving forward?" he asked, and there was something almost businesslike in his tone now, like he was trying to reposition himself in relation to me. And I looked down at the table for a moment, at the plates, the glasses, the carefully arranged setting that had been chosen to impress, and then I looked back up at him and said, "I have a few decisions to make." And that was true, more true than anything else I had said that night, because this was not just about revealing what I had built, it was about deciding what I was going to do with it, who I was going to share it with, and who I was not, and my mother's smile tightened slightly at that, like she heard something in my tone she did not like, something that did not include her the way she expected, and Madison leaned back in her chair, watching me more carefully now, no longer laughing, no longer dismissing, but also not fully accepting, and I could feel the shift settling into the room. The new balance forming, unstable, uncertain, and for the first time I was not trying to find my place in it, I was deciding whether I even wanted one, but what I did not realize then was that they were already deciding something too, something that would test whether this new version of me was willing to hold the line or fall back into the role they were more comfortable with. My father did not wait long before making his move, because he never did when he sensed an opportunity to reestablish control, and he leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the table, his tone shifting into something that sounded almost conversational but carried the weight of expectation underneath it. "Well, since you have built something substantial," he said, choosing each word carefully now, "it might be time to start thinking about how that fits into the family." And there it was, the pivot, the subtle shift from dismissal to inclusion, not because anything about me had changed in their eyes before tonight, but because now there was something they could use, something they could align with, and my mother nodded immediately, her expression soft but intent. Your father is right, she added. We have always believed in supporting each other when it matters, and I almost let out a breath at that, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed exactly what I had already begun to understand, that acceptance, at least in this family, was conditional, always had been, always would be, and Madison leaned in as well, her earlier hesitation gone now, replaced with a kind of confidence that felt familiar again. Actually, that reminds me, she said, glancing briefly at my parents before looking back at me. Our firm has been looking into expanding partnerships with service providers, especially ones that already have established contracts. And I watched her, carefully noticing how quickly she had repositioned herself, how naturally she slipped into a tone that assumed access, assumed alignment, assumed that whatever I had built would now somehow be connected to her world. And I said nothing, not yet, because I wanted to hear how far they would take it, and my father continued, his voice steady, almost reassuring. There are ways we can help you scale this properly, he said. Connection, structure, oversight. And each word landed exactly the way he intended it to, like he was offering something valuable, something I should be grateful for, and my mother added quickly, and it would be good for you to have guidance, Claire, especially with something this important. And I could feel the room shifting again, not back to what it was before, but into something new. Something that looked a lot like negotiation, except I had not agreed to be part of it, and Madison smiled slightly, the kind of smile that assumed the outcome had already been decided. We could even position your company under a larger umbrella, she said. Give it more credibility. And that word credibility landed harder than anything else, because it carried the implication that what I had built on my own was somehow incomplete without them. And I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger, not frustration, just clarity, and I reached for my glass, taking a small sip of water before setting it back down carefully, giving myself a second to choose my words, not react to theirs, and I looked at each of them in turn, my father, my mother, Madison, and I said, I did not build this to hand it over. And the simplicity of that sentence seemed to catch them off guard more than anything else I had said that night, because it did not argue, it did not explain, it just set a boundary, and my father's expression tightened slightly, not openly displeased but no longer relaxed. No one is suggesting that, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. We are talking about making it stronger, and I held his gaze steady. It is already strong, I replied, and my mother's smile faded just a fraction, replaced with something more cautious. Claire, we are only trying to help, she said, and I nodded once, acknowledging the words without accepting them, and Madison leaned back in her chair again, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied me, as if trying to decide whether this was a phase, a reaction, or something more permanent. And for a moment no one spoke, because this was unfamiliar territory, not just for them but for me too, holding my ground without explaining it away, without softening it to make it easier for them to accept. And I could feel the weight of that choice, not heavy in a painful way but solid, like something finally set in place after years of shifting. And I rested my hands on the table again, calm, composed, because this was the part that mattered, not the reveal, not the numbers, but what came after, how I chose to stand in it. And as I looked at them, really looked at them, I realized something I had not fully admitted to myself before, that this was not just about proving them wrong, it was about deciding whether I was willing to let them redefine me now that I no longer fit the version they had always used. And in that moment I knew the answer, but what I did not know yet was how they would respond to it once they realized I was not going to play along anymore. Madison's smile faded first, not completely, but enough that I could see the shift behind it, the calculation returning, sharper this time, and she tapped her fingers lightly against the table before saying, No one is asking you to hand anything over, Claire, we are talking about alignment. And the way she said that word made it sound like something inevitable, like something that would happen whether I agreed to it or not. And my father nodded slightly, reinforcing it. It would be irresponsible not to consider it, he added, his tone firm again, slipping back into the version of himself that had always assumed he knew what was best for everyone in the room. And I let that sit there for a moment, not reacting, just listening, because this was the part that mattered more than anything else, not what they were offering, but how quickly they had moved from dismissal to expectation, from laughter to leverage. And my mother leaned in closer, her voice softer now, almost persuasive. We are family, she said. We look out for each other. And I almost nodded out of habit, because that sentence had been used so many times before, in so many different ways, always sounding supportive on the surface while quietly demanding something underneath it. And I could feel the old version of myself, the one who would have tried to meet them halfway, who would have explained, justified, softened everything until it was easier for them to accept. And I recognized it for what it was, not kindness, not compromise, but survival, and I did not need that anymore. And I looked at my mother, then at my father, then at Madison, and I said, "You are not looking out for me, you are looking at what I built." And that landed differently, heavier, because it was not emotional, it was accurate, and for a second no one spoke, because there was no easy way to argue with that without proving it true. And my father's expression tightened further, not angry but no longer neutral. "That is not fair," he said, and I tilted my head slightly, considering that, and I replied, "It is honest." And Madison exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair again, her patience thinning. "So what? You are just going to shut us out?" she said, and there it was, the pivot. Again from inclusion to accusation, because if they could not position themselves as helpful, they would position me as ungrateful, and I shook my head once, calm, steady. "No, I am deciding who gets access," I said, and I could feel the weight of that sentence settle into the room because it changed the dynamic completely. It was no longer about whether I fit into their structure, it was about whether they fit into mine, and my mother's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to discomfort. "Claire, this is not how family works," she said, and I almost smiled at that, because it was exactly how family had worked for them for years, just in the opposite direction, and I said, "It is how it works now." And the silence that followed was different from before, not confused, not uncertain, but tense, because now the lines were clear, and no one at that table was used to that, especially not when it came from me. And my father leaned forward again, his voice lower, more controlled. "You are making a mistake," he said, and I met his gaze without hesitation. "Maybe," I replied, "but it will be mine." And that seemed to take something out of him, not completely, but enough that he leaned back again, reassessing, recalibrating, and Madison looked at me for a long second, really looked at me this time like she was trying to find the version of me she was used to, the one she could predict, the one she could dismiss, and she did not find it. And for the first time that night, she did not have a response ready, and I sat there calm, grounded, because this was no longer about proving anything, it was about holding the space I had created for myself without letting them reshape it. And as I looked around the table, at the faces that had once defined how I saw myself, I realized something that felt both simple and impossible at the same time, that I did not need them to understand me for any of this to matter, and that realization changed everything. But what I did not realize then was that the night was not over, and the next moment would force all of us to confront just how much had actually changed. The tension did not break, it deepened, settling into the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel louder. The faint clink of silverware from another table, the soft footsteps of staff moving behind us, and then it shifted again when someone approached from my left, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, and I recognized the voice before I even turned. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly, respectful but clear, and I glanced up to see Daniel, the general manager, standing just behind my chair with his hands loosely clasped in front of him, his posture professional but attentive. And for a second no one else reacted because they did not understand why he was speaking to me like that, why his tone carried a level of acknowledgement they had never heard directed at me before. And I met his eyes and nodded once. "Yes," I said, and he leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to keep it within our table but not enough to hide it. "The staff is ready whenever you would like to proceed." And the words were simple, but the effect was immediate, because now it was not just about numbers on a screen or ownership on paper. It was about presence, about authority that existed beyond this table, and I could feel every pair of eyes shift again, sharper this time, trying to understand what exactly he meant, and my father's gaze moved from Daniel to me, then back again, his expression tightening in a way I had not seen before, not confusion, not dismissal, but something closer to uncertainty, and Madison sat up straighter, her earlier confidence slipping just enough to show the cracks. "Proceed with what?" she asked, her voice quick, almost too quick. And I did not answer immediately, because I wanted them to sit in that question, to feel it the way I had felt every unanswered question they had left me with over the years, and I turned slightly in my chair, just enough to face Daniel more directly, and said, "Give me a few minutes," and he nodded without hesitation. "Of course," he replied, stepping back just as quietly as he had approached, and as he walked away, the silence he left behind felt heavier than before, because now there was something tangible in it. Something they could not ignore or explain away, and my mother was the first to speak, her voice lower now, more careful. "Claire, what was that?" she asked, and I looked back at her, calm, steady, and said, "Just part of the night." And that did not satisfy her. I could see it in the way her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table, the way her eyes searched my face for something familiar and did not find it, and my father leaned forward again, but this time slower, more deliberate. "You are hosting something here," he said, not quite a question, more like a realization forming in real time, and I did not rush to confirm it. I just held his gaze for a second before saying, "Yes," and Madison let out a short breath, shaking her head slightly. "You planned this," she said, and there was something in her voice now that was different from before, not mocking, not dismissive, but unsettled, like she was realizing that this entire night had not been what she thought it was, that she had been reacting instead of controlling. And I nodded once. "I did," I said, and my uncle glanced between all of us, his earlier curiosity now mixed with something closer to respect. "Well, that is one way to make a point," he muttered under his breath, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was clever, but because it was the closest anyone had come to understanding what this actually was, and my mother inhaled slowly, as if she was trying to regain some sense of composure. "You could have just told us," she said, and I looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, and I said, "Would you have listened?" And she did not answer, because we both knew the truth of that. And the table fell quiet again, but this time it was different, not tense in the same way, not filled with resistance, but with something else, something that felt like the beginning of acceptance mixed with the discomfort of losing control. And I rested my hands lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the moment, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about finishing what I had started, and I glanced briefly toward the far end of the room where Daniel had disappeared. Knowing exactly what was waiting, exactly what I had set in motion long before tonight, and I looked back at my family, at the people who had defined me for so long, and for the first time I saw them clearly, not as authority, not as judgment, but as people reacting to something they could not shape, and I realized then that this was the moment everything would shift completely, not just for me but for them too. But what they did not know was that I had not come here to prove I was successful. I had come here to show them exactly what their version of me had cost them. My father was the one who broke the silence again, but this time his voice was lower, more measured, like he was choosing every word carefully because he no longer knew which version of the situation he was standing in. "Claire," he said, "what exactly are you planning to do?" And there was something different in the way he asked it, not authority, not assumption, but uncertainty, and I let that sit for a moment because I could feel the weight of the question, not just for him, but for me too. And I glanced around the table, at the faces that had once felt so fixed, so certain in how they saw me, and now looked something closer to unsettled, like the ground under them had shifted and they were still trying to find their balance. And I said, "I am going to finish what I started." And that did not clarify anything for them. I could see it in the way my mother's brows pulled together slightly, the way Madison leaned forward again, waiting for more, and my uncle set his glass down a little too carefully, like he did not want to interrupt whatever was coming next, and I reached for my phone again, not to show them anything new, but to lock the screen and set it aside, because this part was not about numbers anymore. It was about something else entirely, and I stood up slowly from my chair, feeling every eye on me as I did, not in the same way as before, not judging, not dismissing, but watching, trying to understand, and I could hear the faint shift of chairs as a few people instinctively straightened, unsure whether they were supposed to follow or stay seated. And I placed my napkin neatly on the table beside my plate, a small deliberate motion that felt more final than anything else I had done that night. And I looked at my parents, then at Madison, holding their gaze just long enough for them to realize this was not a reaction, not a moment of emotion, but a decision, and I said, "Stay here." And there was no edge in my voice, no demand, just certainty, and that seemed to stop them more than anything else could have, because they were not used to being told what to do by me. And I turned then, stepping away from the table, aware of the quiet that followed me, the way conversations at nearby tables seemed to dim just slightly as I moved through the room, not because anyone knew who I was, but because there was something in the way I walked, something intentional, something that did not match the version of me that had been sitting at that table just minutes ago. And I made my way toward the far side of the dining room where the lighting softened and the staff moved with that same quiet efficiency I had learned to appreciate over the years, and I saw Daniel waiting there, exactly where I expected him to be, his posture straight, his attention focused, and he gave a small nod as I approached. "Whenever you are ready," he said, and I glanced back once, just once, at the table, at my family, who were now watching me from a distance, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something else, something closer to apprehension, and I realized then that this was the moment where everything separated, where the story they had told about me no longer had any place in what came next. And I turned back to Daniel and said, "Let us begin." And he gestured subtly toward a small raised platform near the center of the room that I had chosen weeks ago, not for its visibility, but for what it represented, a space that belonged to the room but was set apart from it, and as I walked toward it, I could feel the shift ripple outward, not dramatic, not loud but unmistakable as a few heads turned, as the ambient noise softened just enough to create a pocket of attention, and I stepped up onto the platform, turning to face the room, the table, my family, and for a second I let the moment settle, not rushing it, not filling it with words, because this was not about speaking first, it was about being seen. And I could see them now, really see them, my father leaning forward slightly, my mother's hand resting against her glass, Madison's posture rigid, all of them watching in a way they never had before, and I realized something then, something that felt both simple and profound, that I had spent years trying to earn their attention, their approval, their acknowledgement, and now that I had it, I no longer needed it. But what they did not know was that what I was about to say next was not for them, it was for every version of me they had never bothered to see. I did not start speaking right away, and that was intentional because silence has a way of pulling people in more than words ever could, and I let it settle over the room, over the soft clinking of glasses that slowly faded, over the quiet conversations that paused one by one as attention shifted, and I could feel it, not just from my table, but from the entire space, a subtle awareness building. And when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, not raised, not forced, just clear enough to carry. "Good evening," I said, and a few heads turned fully now, conversation stopping completely as people recognized that something was happening, something out of the ordinary, and I rested one hand lightly against the edge of the podium, grounding myself, not because I was nervous but because this moment mattered, not in the way my family would think, not as a performance but as a marker, line between what had been and what would not be anymore, and I continued. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is Claire Bennett," and I let that sit for a second because names have a way of carrying weight when they are finally said in the right place, in the right context, and I glanced briefly toward my table, just enough to see them watching, really watching now, not interrupting, not reacting, just listening, and I went on, "I want to thank you for being here tonight, for celebrating a space that means a great deal to me." And I could see a few people exchanging glances, subtle, curious, because the way I said it implied something more than just attendance, something tied to ownership, to connection, and I did not rush to clarify it. I let it build piece by piece, the way I had built everything else, slowly, deliberately, and I said, "This restaurant is part of a group that I have had the privilege of working with over the past few years." And I paused there, because that word working could mean many things, and I knew exactly how it would be heard, how it would be interpreted, and I let them sit in that assumption for just a moment longer before I added, "And more recently, it has become something more personal to me." And I could feel the shift ripple again, subtle but undeniable, and I continued, "I started my career in places most people do not notice, after hours, behind closed doors, doing work that keeps everything else running." And as I said that, I could see it land differently across the room, not dramatic, not emotional, but real, because everyone understands what it means to be unseen, even if they do not admit it, and I went on, "And for a long time that was all I was to a lot of people. Someone who showed up when no one was looking and left before anyone cared to ask what I was doing there." And I did not look directly at my family when I said that, but I did not need to because I could feel the weight of it reach them anyway, and I let a small pause follow, not heavy, just enough to let the words settle, and then I said, "But what most people do not realize is that when you spend enough time in the background, you start to see things differently, you start to understand how everything connects, how small details turn into larger systems, how consistency turns into growth." And I could see a few nods now, people leaning in, recognizing something familiar in what I was saying, even if they did not know the full story behind it, and I continued. "So I built something quietly, step by step, not because anyone expected me to, but because I needed to prove something to myself. And I let that hang there because that was the truth that mattered, not the money, not the ownership, but the reason behind it." And I glanced once more toward my table, seeing the stillness there, the attention, the shift that had not faded, and I realized that this moment was no longer just about them, it was about claiming something I had never been given, and I said, "And tonight is not about showing what that has become." And I paused again, just long enough to feel the room hold its breath. "It is about deciding what comes next." And I let the words settle into the silence that followed because I knew this was the point where everything changed, not just how they saw me, but how I chose to move forward from here. But what I did not say, what I kept to myself, was that some of those decisions had already been made long before I ever walked into this room. The silence after my last sentence did not feel empty, it felt full, like the room itself was holding something just beneath the surface, waiting to see where I would take it next. And I let that pause stretch a little longer because I had learned that people listen differently when they think something matters, and then I continued, my voice steady. Over the past 3 years, that work has grown into something larger than I ever expected. And I could see the shift again. The subtle lean forward from a few tables, the way people recalibrated their attention when they realized this was not just a polite introduction, and I went on. What started as a single cleaning contract turned into a company that now manages over 40 commercial properties across 3 states, including medical offices, law firms, and hospitality spaces like this one. And I did not rush through the details. I let each piece land because numbers and specifics have a way of grounding a story in reality, making it harder to dismiss, and I could feel the room responding to that, not with applause, not with interruption, but with focus. And I added, we currently employ 32 people, most of whom started the same way I did, working late hours, doing work that rarely gets recognized but always gets noticed when it is not done. And that line carried further than I expected, not louder but deeper, and I saw a few heads nod, a few expressions shift into something more thoughtful, and I let myself glance back at my table again, just for a second, and I saw it clearly now, my father sitting straighter than before, his expression no longer controlled but attentive, my mother watching with a kind of quiet intensity, and Madison completely still, her earlier confidence replaced by something I could not quite name, something that looked a lot like realization. And I turned back to the room, continuing without breaking rhythm. A few months ago I was given the opportunity to invest in this restaurant group, and I paused just enough for that to register, and I chose to do it not because I needed to prove anything but because I believe in building something that lasts, and I could feel the weight of that sentence settle differently, not just as information but as intention, and I rested both hands lightly on the podium, grounding myself again, because this next part mattered more than anything I had said so far. And I said, but none of this would have meant anything if I had not also learned something along the way. And I let that sit just long enough to shift the tone, to move it from success to something more personal, and I continued, I learned that being underestimated can either define you or refine you, and for a long time I let it define me. And I could feel that land not just in the room but in myself, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it never had. And I added, I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. I accepted things that I should not have accepted, and I tried to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. And I did not look at my family when I said that, but I knew they heard it, I knew they felt it, because it was not vague, it was specific without needing to be detailed. And I let a small pause follow before finishing the thought. And eventually I realized that the problem was never what I was doing, it was who I was trying to prove it to. And that was the line that shifted everything, not just for them, but for me, because it marked the difference between who I had been and who I had become. And the room stayed quiet, not out of confusion but out of attention, the kind that comes when something resonates whether you expect it to or not. And I took a small breath, steady, controlled, and said, so tonight is not about showing what I have built. And I let my eyes move across the room once more, taking in the faces, the stillness, the awareness. It is about being clear about what I will not build anymore. And I did not explain that further, not yet, because some things are stronger when they are allowed to sit just beneath the surface, waiting to be understood rather than spelled out. But what they did not know was that the next decision I was about to reveal would make that clarity impossible to ignore. The room did not move, it held, like everyone understood that whatever came next was not just a continuation but a turning point. And I let that stillness stay exactly where it was before I spoke again, my voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach every table without forcing it. There is a difference between building something for yourself and building something for the approval of others, I said, and I could feel the shift in attention sharpen, not broader but deeper. And I continued, for a long time I thought if I worked hard enough, if I proved enough, if I showed results that could not be ignored, then the way I was seen would change. And I paused there, not for effect, but because that was the truth I had carried for years. And I added, and in some ways it did. Letting my eyes move briefly toward my table, just long enough to acknowledge the obvious, but not in the way I expected. And I turned back to the room, grounding myself again with both hands resting lightly on the podium, and I said, because what I realized is that when people are committed to a version of you, they do not always update that version, they adjust around it. And that line settled into the room differently, quieter, heavier, and I could see it in the stillness, the way no one interrupted, the way no one shifted. And I went on, They explain your success in ways that make sense to them, they position themselves in ways that keep their perspective intact, and they call it support. And I let that sit, not accusing, not emotional, just clear, and I could feel the weight of it reaching the table behind me without needing to turn, and I continued. And there is nothing wrong with that, it is human, it is predictable. And I nodded slightly, acknowledging it. But it is also something you have to recognize if you want to move forward honestly. And I paused again because this was the part that mattered most, the part that would define everything that came after, and I said, so I made a decision. And the room seemed to lean in just slightly, not physically but in focus, and I went on, not about what I am building but about who I am building it with, and I could feel the shift immediately, because now it was no longer abstract, no longer philosophical, it was specific, and I let that hang for a second before continuing. Over the next year we are expanding into 2 additional states, adding new contracts and increasing our team, and I spoke the details. Calmly, not to impress but to establish reality, to make it clear that this was not potential, it was already in motion, and I added, and as part of that I have been very intentional about the partnerships we form, the people we bring in, and the roles we create, and I let my gaze move across the room again, steady, grounded, before finishing the thought, because growth is not just about scale, it is about alignment, and I paused there, letting the word land fully because I knew it would echo differently for some people than others, and then I said, and alignment is not automatic, it is chosen. And that was the line that shifted everything because it made the implication clear without stating it directly, and I could feel it not just in the room but behind me at the table where my family sat, where every word now carried weight in a way it never had before, and I let a small breath settle before continuing. So tonight is also about clarity, I said, about being honest, about what fits and what does not. And I did not elaborate beyond that because I did not need to, the meaning was already there, already understood, already impossible to ignore, and I rested my hands once more against the podium, steady, composed, because this was no longer about explaining myself, it was about defining the boundary that had been missing for years, and as I looked out at the room, at the quiet attention, at the awareness that had replaced the earlier noise, I realized that this moment was not just a reveal, it was a reset, a shift in direction that could not be undone, but what they did not know was that the final piece of that decision was not something I was going to say out loud, it was something I was about to show them. For a moment I said nothing, and that was intentional because some decisions do not need to be announced to be understood, they need to be demonstrated, and I let my hands rest lightly on the podium as I looked out across the room, then slowly, deliberately, I turned my gaze back toward my table, toward my family, and I held it there just long enough for them to realize that what came next was not for the room. It was for them, and I stepped down from the platform without another word, the soft sound of my heels against the floor carrying farther than anything I had said. And as I walked back across the dining room, I could feel the attention follow me, not in the same way as before, not curious, not casual, but focused, waiting, and when I reached the table, I did not sit down, I remained standing, looking at each of them in turn, my father, my mother, Madison, and I let the silence settle one last time before I spoke, my voice quiet now but steady. I meant what I said. I told them about deciding what comes next. And my father opened his mouth slightly like he was about to respond, but then he stopped because for the first time he did not have a version of this moment prepared. And my mother watched me carefully, her expression no longer composed but searching, like she was trying to understand something she had never had to question before. And Madison sat completely still, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by something closer to awareness, and I continued, I am not angry. And that was the truth, not the version of it they might expect, not the emotional release that would make this easier for them to categorize. I am just clear. And that word seemed to land harder than anything else because it left no room for interpretation, and I reached down, picking up my bag from beside my chair, a simple motion, but one that carried more meaning than any explanation could, and I said, I built something on my own without your approval, without your understanding, and without your support, and I paused not for effect but because it deserved to be said completely, and I am going to keep building it the same way. And my father finally spoke then, his voice lower than before, not authoritative, not dismissive, just uncertain. Claire, that is not what we meant. And I met his gaze, calm, steady, and I said, I know. And that was the difference. I understood exactly what they meant, exactly how they saw things, and I was choosing not to step back into that space, and my mother leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. We can do better, she said, and for a second, just a second, I felt the weight of that possibility, the version of this moment where things shifted in a different direction, Where words like that came earlier meant more, changed something, but I let it pass, not because I did not believe her, but because belief was not the point anymore. And I shook my head gently, not rejecting her, but setting the boundary clearly. Maybe, I said, but I am not waiting for that anymore. And Madison exhaled slowly, looking down at the table for the first time all night, and I could see it then, not defeat, not regret, but recognition, the understanding that something had changed in a way that could not be undone. And I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, grounding myself in the moment, because this was it, the end of something that had defined me for longer than I realized. And I looked at them one last time, not with resentment, not with distance, but with clarity, and I said, "Take care of yourselves." And then I turned, not waiting for a response, not needing one, and I walked away from the table, from the room, from the version of myself that had stayed too long in places that never saw her clearly. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, the quiet of it settling around me, I realized something that felt both simple and impossible at the same time, that for the first time in my life, I was not leaving something behind, I was finally choosing where I belonged. But what I did not realize then was that this was not an ending. It was the beginning of a life I had never allowed myself to imagine.